In a congressional hearing that was meant to be routine, 27-year-old Karoline Leavitt stood her ground as Nancy Pelosi tried to dismantle her credibility. Nobody expected the young press secretary to come armed with facts that would turn the tables on one of Washington's most powerful figures. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. The oak-paneled committee room buzzed with anticipation. Congressional staffers whispered among themselves as cameras positioned strategically around the chamber, prepared to capture what many expected would be a political execution. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest deputy White House press secretary, in recent memory, sat alone at the witness table arranging a modest stack of papers before her. Her calm demeanor belied the gravity of the situation. Nancy Pelosi entered from a side door, flanked by senior aides. The former speaker moved with practiced authority, acknowledging colleagues with slight nods as she took her seat at the center of the raised dais. The chamber quieted instantly. This hearing of the Select Committee on Economic Transparency is now in session, announced the chairman, his voice echoing through the room. Today we have Ms. Karoline Leavitt, Deputy White House Press Secretary, to address recent statements regarding economic indicators that have been called into question. Leavitt leaned toward her microphone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the administration's position on our economic progress. Pelosi adjusted her reading glasses, not bothering to look up from her notes. Ms. Leavitt, you've made several claims about job growth and inflation that simply do not align with the data my office has compiled. I find it concerning that someone in your position would mislead the American people so blatantly. The accusation hung in the air. A few committee members shifted uncomfortably. Respectfully, Representative Pelosi, Leavitt replied, her voice steady. I believe there might be a discrepancy in the data sets we're referencing. Pelosi smiled thinly. There's no discrepancy, Ms. Leavitt. There are facts, and then there are your administration's interpretations. She gestured to an aide who promptly displayed a series of charts on the large screen behind the dais. These numbers clearly show stagnant job growth in manufacturing sectors and persistent inflation affecting middle-class families. The graphs were stark, showing downward trends in employment and upward curves in consumer prices. Several journalists in the gallery began typing furiously on their laptops. Leavitt didn't flinch. May I respond to these specific charts, Representative? By all means, Pelosi replied with a dismissive wave. Though I'm not sure what response could possibly contradict what we all can see. Leavitt reached into her folder and produced a thumb drive. With the chairman's permission, I'd like to display the complete data sets from which those excerpts were taken. The chairman nodded, and a committee technician took the drive. Moments later, new graphics appeared on the screen. Expanded versions of the same charts, but with crucial differences. As you can see, Leavitt explained, pointing to the screen, the manufacturing job data presented by Representative Pelosi isolates 3 specific sectors that have indeed struggled. However, the complete Bureau of Labor Statistics report shows 17 manufacturing categories, 14 of which demonstrate significant growth over the past 18 months. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as journalists leaned forward in their seats. Furthermore, Leavitt continued, her confidence growing visibly, the inflation chart presented earlier tracks only unprocessed food and energy costs, which are inherently volatile. The core inflation index, which economists traditionally rely on for stability measurements, shows a steady decrease for 5 consecutive quarters. Pelosi's expression hardened as she flipped quickly through her briefing materials. These alternative interpretations don't change the reality that American families are struggling under your administration's policies. I agree completely that many Americans are facing challenges, Leavitt responded, which is why context and accurate representation of data are so crucial for public trust. A congressman from Michigan leaned toward his microphone. Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting that Representative Pelosi deliberately presented misleading information? Before Leavitt could answer, Pelosi interjected. I find it remarkable that someone with your limited experience would presume to lecture this committee on economic analysis. Perhaps your youth explains your naivety about how these indicators actually impact real people. The personal attack created a palpable tension. Camera operators zoomed in on Leavitt's face, ready to capture any sign of intimidation or weakness. Leavitt took a measured breath. My age doesn't change the numbers, Representative Pelosi, nor does my experience alter the methodology of the Federal Reserve or the Bureau of Labor Statistics. She opened another folder and began distributing documents to the committee members. What I've provided is the full quarterly economic assessment from the Congressional Budget Office, the same office that reports to this Congress. As committee members reviewed the documents, Pelosi's aide whispered urgently in her ear. Her expression darkened. Mr. Chairman, Pelosi said sharply, I request a brief recess to review these materials. Denied, the chairman replied. Ms. Leavitt, please continue. Leavitt nodded. The summary on page 3 clearly indicates that while challenges remain, particularly in energy and housing sectors, the overall economic trajectory shows marked improvement across multiple indicators. The report specifically notes, and I quote, unexpectedly robust growth in small business formation and non-urban employment opportunities. Several committee members were now engrossed in the report, comparing its findings to the selective charts Pelosi had presented earlier. Journalists in the gallery were frantically updating their stories. Pelosi's strategy was unraveling before the cameras. What was meant to be a straightforward humiliation of an inexperienced political appointee was transforming into something entirely different. She needed to regain control quickly. Ms. Leavitt, Pelosi said, interrupting the young woman as she explained a particularly compelling graph, I've been in Congress longer than you've been alive. I've seen administrations come and go, each with their creative interpretations of economic data. What you're doing here today isn't novel. It's simply the latest version of spin. The room grew quiet, waiting for Leavitt's response. This wasn't just about economic indicators anymore. It was a direct challenge to her integrity and competence. Representative Pelosi, Leavitt said, her voice quiet but clear. With all due respect to your experience, which I genuinely admire, the facts aren't partisan. They don't spin. They simply are. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Several committee members exchanged glances as Pelosi's lips tightened into a thin line. She hadn't expected such composure from someone she'd dismissed as a political novice. Facts require context, Ms. Leavitt, Pelosi countered, tapping her pen against the table. And the context here is that your administration has consistently cherry-picked data points to paint a rosy picture while everyday Americans struggle to make ends meet. Leavitt nodded thoughtfully. I couldn't agree more about the importance of context, which is why I've brought the complete economic assessment rather than excerpts. She gestured toward the documents she'd distributed. Page 7 addresses the very concern you've raised about everyday Americans. Would you mind reading the highlighted section, Representative? A power move. Leavitt was asking Pelosi to read aloud findings that contradicted her own narrative. The room tensed as cameras swiveled between the two women. Pelosi didn't touch the document. I'm well aware of what selective highlighting can accomplish, Ms. Leavitt. What I'm interested in is why your press briefings have consistently omitted mentions of the housing affordability crisis affecting working families. An excellent question, Leavitt replied without hesitation. She pulled another document from her folder. In fact, we've addressed housing affordability in 12 separate briefings since January. I've compiled the transcripts with relevant economic data referenced in each instance. She handed the document to a committee aide who delivered it to Pelosi. The veteran politician briefly scanned the pages, her expression unchanged, though those seated nearest to her noticed her knuckles whitening around her pen. Convenient compilations aside, Pelosi said, the fact remains that your administration's policies have failed to curb investment property speculation, which continues to drive up costs for first-time homebuyers. A congressman from Arizona leaned forward. If I may interject, the report does indicate a 12% decrease in corporate property investment following the tax policy adjustments implemented last quarter. Pelosi shot him a look that could have frozen the Potomac. Temporary. Market fluctuations are not indicative of long-term trends, Congressman. Actually, Leavitt interjected, pulling up a slide on the screen, when we examine the 5-year projection models from both the Federal Reserve and independent analysts at Stanford's Economic Policy Research Center, we see that the decline in corporate property investment is projected to continue. She highlighted a downward trend line. This correlates directly with increased first-time homebuyer rates in previously unaffordable metropolitan areas. The committee chairman leaned forward. Ms. Leavitt, these projections contradict the testimony we heard last month from the Housing and Urban Development Secretary. A potential trap. Everyone in the room knew the HUD secretary had been appointed by the previous administration and had publicly sparred with Leavitt's team over economic forecasting methodology. They appear contradictory only if viewed in isolation, Leavitt replied smoothly. The secretary was specifically addressing public housing initiatives, while these projections focus on private market dynamics. Both assessments can be simultaneously accurate within their defined parameters. Pelosi seized the opening. So you acknowledge that your administration's public housing initiatives are failing, even as you claim success in the private sector? Not at all, Representative, Leavitt countered. Public housing initiatives operate on different timelines and metrics than private market interventions. The HUD secretary's concerns were specifically about funding allocation schedules, not overall program efficacy. She pulled up another slide showing comparative data between funding authorization and distribution timelines. As you can see, while authorization has proceeded on schedule, there have been bureaucratic delays in fund distribution, delays that originated during the previous administration, and that we've been systematically addressing. A congresswoman from Oregon spoke up. Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting that Representative Pelosi is unfamiliar with how government funding mechanisms work? The question was designed to bait Leavitt into appearing condescending toward Pelosi's decades of experience, a political trap that would shift the narrative from economic facts to personal respect. Leavitt shook her head. Not at all, Congresswoman. Few people understand government funding mechanisms better than Representative Pelosi, which is why I'm surprised by the mischaracterization of these specific economic indicators. The subtle counterpunch landed perfectly. Without directly accusing Pelosi of deliberate misrepresentation, Leavitt had implied that someone with Pelosi's expertise wouldn't make such basic analytical errors accidentally. Pelosi's eyes narrowed. Ms. Leavitt, your administration's creative interpretations of economic data might impress those unfamiliar with historical patterns, but they don't change the reality that core economic promises made during the campaign remain unfulfilled. Historical patterns are precisely what validate our approach, Representative, Leavitt responded, advancing to a new slide showing comparative economic recoveries across 5 decades. When we examine post-recession recovery patterns since 1980, our current trajectory aligns most closely with the 1996 recovery, which, as you'll recall, led to one of the strongest economic expansions in modern history. The slide was compelling. Color-coded trend lines showing unmistakable similarities between current economic indicators and those from the mid-1990s prosperity period. Even some of Pelosi's allies on the committee were studying the data with interest. Pelosi glanced at her chief aide, who subtly shook his head. They didn't have contradictory data ready for this specific comparison. She would need to pivot. Historical analogies make for interesting academic discussions, Ms. Leavitt, but they offer cold comfort to families facing rising costs today. Rather than statistical sleight of hand, perhaps your time would be better spent explaining why your administration's inflation reduction targets remain unmet. It was a direct challenge, and everyone in the room knew it. Leavitt had been building a case based on comprehensive data and contextual analysis. Pelosi was now dismissing the entire approach as academic and irrelevant, a powerful political technique that had derailed many previous testimonies. The chamber fell silent. Journalists paused their typing, waiting for Leavitt's reaction. Would she become defensive? Would she finally stumble? Leavitt calmly took a sip of water. The pause stretched just long enough to build tension without appearing evasive. "Representative Pelosi," she finally said, "I believe families facing rising costs deserve more than political talking points. They deserve accurate information about what's actually happening in the economy, what's caused current conditions, and what credible solutions look like." Leavitt reached for another document, sliding it across to the committee members. "This is the full inflation analysis broken down by sector, region, and demographic impact. The administration never claimed we had met all inflation reduction targets. What we've stated, consistently, is that we've met 78% of our quarterly benchmarks despite global supply chain disruptions that were beyond any administration's control." She highlighted a section of the report. Page 23 addresses the three sectors where inflation remains problematic: healthcare, education, and certain food categories. It also details the specific policy interventions being implemented to address each. Pelosi's frustration was becoming visible. This hearing was supposed to discredit Leavitt, not provide her a platform to showcase comprehensive command of economics policy. "Ms. Leavitt," Pelosi said sharply, "these technical explanations obscure a fundamental truth. Americans are hurting economically under your administration's watch." "Americans have been hurting economically since the pandemic," Leavitt corrected gently. "Under the previous administration, under the current one, and likely into the next. Recovery from a once-in-a-century economic disruption doesn't happen overnight, as I believe you yourself noted during the 2008 financial crisis." Several journalists raised eyebrows at the reference. Leavitt had just quoted Pelosi's own words back to her, words spoken when Pelosi was defending similar economic recovery metrics during a different administration. "The circumstances were entirely different," Pelosi countered. "The circumstances are always different," Leavitt agreed, "but economic principles remain consistent, which is why context and honest analysis matter more than selective presentations designed to score political points." The chairman cleared his throat. "Let's refocus on the specific claims that prompted this hearing. Representative Pelosi, you allege that Ms. Leavitt misrepresented job growth figures in her May 12 press briefing. Do you stand by that allegation in light of the documentation provided today?" All eyes turned to Pelosi. The documentation Leavitt had provided clearly supported her original statements. To maintain the allegation would require dismissing data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics itself. The documentation selectively emphasizes certain aspects of a complex economic landscape, Pelosi replied carefully. "That's not what I asked," the chairman pressed. "Did Ms. Leavitt misrepresent job growth figures as you alleged?" The room fell silent. Even Pelosi's allies on the committee seemed uncomfortable with the corner she'd backed herself into. "The technical figures cited were accurate," Pelosi finally conceded. "However, the contextual framing was misleading." "I'd like to address that," Leavitt said, leaning forward. "In the complete transcript of that briefing, which I've provided to the committee, I explicitly acknowledged the uneven nature of the recovery, noting that while overall job growth exceeded projections, certain regions and demographics continue to face challenges. I specifically mentioned the ongoing struggles in rural manufacturing communities and the need for targeted intervention programs." A congressman from Ohio nodded. "That aligns with what I'm seeing in my district. The overall numbers are strong, but the distribution isn't uniform." "Precisely," Leavitt agreed. "Which is why our policy approach has shifted from broad stimulus to targeted investment in underperforming sectors and regions." Pelosi attempted one final offensive. Ms. Leavitt, your administration promised economic relief for working families. Yet after 18 months, many of these families continue to struggle. How do you reconcile your rosy statistical presentations with their lived reality? It was the question Pelosi had been building toward, one that sought to position Leavitt as out of touch with ordinary Americans, regardless of whatever data she might present. There's nothing rosy about acknowledging both progress and persistent challenges, Leavitt responded, her tone serious. When I speak to families in town halls across the country, I don't cite statistics. I listen to their experiences, which reflect exactly what our data shows. Uneven recovery requiring continued focused intervention. She paused, then added, the most disrespectful thing we can do for struggling Americans is to use their hardship as a political weapon rather than addressing root causes with evidence-based solutions. They deserve better than to have their situations mischaracterized for partisan gain by either party. The pointed response silenced the room. Even veteran political journalists exchanged impressed glances. Leavitt had managed to reframe Pelosi's attack as disrespectful to the very people Pelosi claimed to be defending. The chairman checked his watch. We've extended well beyond our scheduled time. Before we conclude, Ms. Leavitt, did you have any final statements for the record? Leavitt gathered her papers methodically. Just this. Economic reality isn't partisan. Data isn't Democratic or Republican. When we allow political narratives to override empirical evidence, we fail the people we're meant to serve. My commitment, and I believe it's one that transcends party lines, is to present economic information accurately, acknowledge both successes and shortcomings transparently, and focus on practical solutions rather than political advantage. She looked directly at Pelosi. I hope that future discussions about economic policy can center on substantive analysis rather than attempts to discredit those with whom we disagree. The American people deserve nothing less. As the hearing adjourned, reporters rushed from the gallery, phones already pressed to ears. Within hours, clips of the exchange would dominate news cycles, social media feeds, and political talk shows. What was intended as a routine hearing to embarrass a young administration official had transformed into something entirely different. Outside the committee room, Leavitt was surrounded by journalists shouting questions. Did you anticipate Representative Pelosi's line of attack? Were you nervous facing such an experienced political figure? Will you be filing a formal response to the allegations made against you? Leavitt raised a hand for quiet. I came prepared with comprehensive economic data because that's my job regardless of who's asking the questions. This wasn't about personalities or politics. It was about ensuring accurate information reaches the American people. Meanwhile, down the hallway, Pelosi's staff hustled her toward a private exit, deflecting questions from trailing reporters. Her expression was stone, but those closest to her could see the calculations already happening behind her eyes. This narrative needed to be controlled, and quickly. Back in the White House Situation Room that evening, the president watched replays of the hearing with his senior advisors. 6 different news networks were covering it, with commentary ranging from glowing praise for Leavitt's poise to analysis of Pelosi's tactical missteps. Get her in here, the president said, gesturing toward Leavitt's image on the screen. 10 minutes later, Leavitt entered, still carrying her briefing materials from the hearing. Sir, she said with a nod. That was quite a performance, the president said, studying her carefully. It wasn't meant to be a performance, Leavitt replied. Just accurate information presented clearly. The president smiled slightly. In Washington, those two things rarely align. He gestured toward the screens still playing clips of the hearing. You've changed the conversation. The question is, where do we take it from here? Leavitt placed her folder on the table. We take it back to the issues that matter. This news cycle will burn itself out in 72 hours. What remains is the work, making sure the economic recovery reaches every American, not just those in thriving sectors. The president nodded slowly. You know they'll come after you harder next time. Today was supposed to be your political execution. Instead, you've made yourself a target. With respect, sir, Leavitt said, if presenting complete and accurate economic data makes me a target, then I welcome the attention, because it means we're finally having the right conversation. As Leavitt left the Oval Office, her phone buzzed with a text from her father, a small business owner in New Hampshire. Saw you on the news. Stood your ground without getting mean. Proud of you, kid. Sometimes, in the midst of Washington's own endless political theater, it was the simplest validations that mattered most.